May you live in interesting times. That is the topic of tonight's byline. Now, this ancient Chinese proverb is both a blessing and a curse, and is being made real right now for the people of the embattled Ukraine. It is also becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy for US President Barack Obama. He has passively watched Vladimir Putin as he has dealt with a little local difficulty in the Crimea by the simple expedient of invading the area. Now, for the most part, Obama has stroked his chin in that Harvard professor mode he knows so well and said, well, that's interesting. Indeed it is. Putin says he is protecting Russian interests. He says he doesn't want a full-scale war, but is prepared to use military might if push comes to bloody shove. Should Russian troops intervene? Putin said this: it will be legitimate and correspond to international law because we have a direct request from a legitimate president, and it corresponds to our interest in protecting people who are close to us. Well, that is just so much nonsense on stilts. Deposed President Viktor Yanukovych is not legitimate. He was sacked by the Ukraine parliament. This was done under the power of the country's constitution, and fresh elections have now been called for May. That's what I meant by living in interesting times. Vladimir Putin sees himself as a peacemaker or peace enforcer, depending on your political viewpoint. You can't deny he's also a man of action. He aggressively seizes territory while others talk about so-called climate change as the greatest existential risk to our age. Listen here as Mr. Putin outlines the perceived threats presented to Russians in the Crimea and just why he remains so keen to intervene.
Firstly, we have a request of the legitimate President Yanukovych to protect the welfare of the local population. We have neo-Nazis, Nazis and anti-Semites in some parts of Ukraine, including Kiev.
The response of the leader of the free world, of Barack Obama, to that self-serving bluster has been a lesson in studied indolence. There's been talk of sanctions, talk of financial help for the almost broke Ukraine, talk of sending in observers, talk of more talks, and even the threat, would you believe it, of no talks at all. Still, Russia is unmoved and the UN Security Council is mostly silent. NATO is looking the other way, and the United Kingdom, France and Germany are struggling to present any sort of coherent joint strategy. Maybe they just hope the whole problem of the Ukraine will go away if it is ignored for long enough. Well, it won't. A return to the appeasement policies of the 1930s is not an option. It's not on the table. That's not to say we can't learn some lessons from the past. Today's the anniversary of Winston Churchill's famous 1946 speech in Fulton, Missouri, where he spoke for the first time about an iron curtain descending over Europe. Now, as we listen again tonight in 2014, the warnings Churchill made then sound almost eerily familiar. Russia again is the unsettling culprit.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe, and all are subject, in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and in some cases increasing measure of control.
Now, historians are pretty unanimous. They regard Churchill's Iron Curtain speech as the beginning of the Cold War. Here we are over half a century later, and plenty of people remain aware of the history of Europe and the need to present an unblinking front against aggression, lest the curtain drops again. Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper's one. He spoke yesterday in Ottawa of the threats he sees at play in the Ukraine, and while a concerted, determined effort has to be made against aggression so that history will not repeat.
Just to reiterate this, what has occurred, as we know, has been the decision of a major power to effectively invade and occupy a neighbouring country based on some kind of extraterritorial claim of jurisdiction over ethnic minorities. Mr. Speaker, we haven't seen this kind of behaviour since the Second World War. This is clearly unacceptable.
Now, Canada has been a leader in world efforts to help prop up a faltering Ukraine, and then this effort cuts across all party lines. A week ago, Foreign Minister John Baird was in Kiev to show the flag, show support and show some money. That's important. It was all helped and it was all positive. A pity the member countries of the EU and the US itself weren't so quick out of the blocks. A pity it was only today that John Kerry met his Russian counterpart in person in Paris. Now, if they weren't so tardy, then we might be seeing armed Russian troops manning blockades in the Crimea or hearing of Russian ICBM missile tests. But that's enough of the past. Let's look ahead. If the world accepts that Russia is staying in the Crimea and going nowhere fast, then that action should have immediate consequences. If nothing happens, then just as surely peace and security nearby Belarus, Romania, Poland and the struggling Baltic republics will also be threatened. The thuggish Vladimir Putin has called Barack Obama's bluff. In doing so, he has devalued any last pretension the US might have left as to its ability to be a force of good in a sometimes, let's admit, very difficult world. Remember I said at the start, we live in interesting times. Well, just remember this. Once the US was seen, rightly or wrongly, as a global policeman. Not anymore. Today, under a dithering Barack Obama, the US is barely a car park attendant. And that's the byline.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
For participation in the G8 summit in Sochi have, of course, been cancelled, and we agree with that.
Mr. Speaker, all Canadians are obviously deeply concerned about the situation unfolding in Ukraine, and we stand in absolute solidarity.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the question from the honourable member and the support of all parties for the government's actions.
Well, it's not so often we see so much cross-party unanimity here in Canada, but everyone is supportive of the fact that the Ukraine needs to be free. And Warren Kinsella is here with me. Now we're going to have a bit of a look at that. How did we get to this point where everyone agrees? Warren, what do you think? Is this a red letter day for Parliament, or why did the gloves go off and why do we start talking like this?
It's a nice thing to see, isn't it? I mean, it's not something we see very often in our politics. In fact, in the U.S. that you referred to in your commentary, it's much more the case. Whenever the U.S. is facing some non-domestic threat, the parties tend to put aside partisanship and come together. So it's nice to see. I guess the question we have to now ask ourselves, though that we've linked arms and come together in this way, is does any of it matter? And is it anything that's going to persuade Putin to abandon the course that he's chosen for himself? And I personally don't think it is. Canada matters, though. Canada was very visible there last week when you had the Foreign Minister travelling. And he did it knowing he had the full support of Parliament back here. I think Canada does matter on the world stage. Canada is seen as providing real moral leadership on this issue. Oh, for sure. And in a way, I think Canada's been out in front of a lot of the world, not include the US in that. Well, the Prime Minister, it's hard to believe that this amount of time has gone by, but he is the second most senior member of the G8. Yeah. You know, he's a senior statesman. So you're right in that regard. He is listened to, just as Chrétien was before him. But the thing is, you know, we all now have to acknowledge, in the case of Syria, in the case of, well, things like the treatment of gays within the Soviet Union, Pussy Riot, the punk rock band has been opposing him. None of these things have had any impact. Our point of view and our objection to the way he's dealt with these issues, these files, none of them have had any impact on him. And I think that... What would have an impact, though? What I think would work at this point, and you would know this from your travels, you know, you go to London, you go to Paris, you go to Palm Springs, you go to any of those places, the language you hear most is obviously the local language. What's the language you hear second most? There is a rising upper middle class in Russia who owe a tremendous amount of allegiance and a lot of, you know, their wealth to Vladimir Putin. So hitting people in the pocket? Hit them in their bank accounts. So, you know, there is a precedent for this in the United States going back a few years called the Magnitsky Act. And the Magnitsky Act was really just basically a list. It ended up only being about 18 Russians who'd been involved in actually the murder of an accountant who was investigating some wrongdoing by Russian nationals. I think the suggestion that's been made from everybody from the Wall Street Journal to you name it, the New York Times, is we now need to look at hitting the people who are loyal to Putin in the pocketbook. They are traveling to Europe. They're educating their kids in that's the oligarchs, schools. Isn't it? The people have the control of the money, the mineral wealth, and the means of trade. And that's the difference from, you know, the clip you showed earlier about, you Prime Minister Churchill speaking. It was a different world there in many respects, but the key difference was the Soviet Union was isolated from us. So we really didn't have many tools apart from military tools to impress upon them our point of view.
And you look at how tremendously linked in the whole world is now. Everyone's linked in, everyone's tied up together, and trade is the engine that drives that.
Correct.
And if we did that, you don't think it's going to hurt some people? There's not going to be collateral damage?
You're going to have Europeans balking at taking the type of action that I'm counseling and others are counseling because they don't want to have a bunch of Europeans spending a very cold winter. However, the U.S. can take steps to correct that. Canada, with our energy reserves, can take steps to offset any kind of discomfort the Europeans are feeling. And, the feeling is, as you just pointed out, the Russian economy is integrated with the Western economy. If we take this step, and it's just really a question of just saying to our bankers, freeze their accounts, it will cause panic at the level of the people in Russia
and focus a few minds.
That's right.
All right, Warren Kinsella, thanks very much.
Pleasure.